Well, it is a Monday, at least according to my calendar, which means I'm back for another one of these crazy between chair and keyboard episodes. I'm delighted that another longtime dear friend of mine, Jeremy Deane, has taken some time out of his busy day to hang out with me in the middle of a move, nonetheless. So I applaud you for that fact. Uh, I think about the stress of moving, and I put it right up there with, yeah, I don't really want to do that ever again. I'm pretty good where I am. Anytime I complain about my house, I'm like, nah, it's just a real pain to pack everything up and move. But good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning. Yeah, and
Actually, good
the
afternoon for
items
you.
definitely
Sorry, I forgot.
accumulate
You're
over
you're on
time.
that other side of the coast, so
That's correct. That's correct. Good afternoon. And the items accumulate with every passing day and minute. And so
right?
just multiply that out, and that's what moving is.
Yeah, 1,000%. We finished our basement a few years ago, like just before the pandemic, and I had no idea how much stuff we had accumulated in our basement until I had to get everything out of there. And I was like, what, how did this happen? I knew we had some wine hiding down there. I just didn't realize it was several cases of wine. Like literally, as I kept kind of finding, oh, I got a box over here with like 7 bottles in it. Oh, interesting. Oh well, the joy of being an adult, I guess.
That's correct.
So, Jeremy, for folks who are unfamiliar with your background, how did you get into this weird space known as software? What brought you to this point in your career? And you can take that in just as pure expert panel approach here, Jeremy. You can take that whatever way you want. You can start at, your parents met all the way up to whenever, or you can begin with 5 minutes ago. It's totally up to you.
Sure. Of course, when a man loves a woman, no, I'm just kidding.
Right.
I won't go into that. I will say my undergrad actually was in business, and I was working for 2 years before I got into software engineering, and I had always thought I would go into the military.
Oh,
But
interesting.
right before I had done ROTC in college, and right before I was about to go and serve, I broke my knee and
Oh,
got
no.
DQ'd, disqualified,
Okay.
so I could no longer serve. And there was this 2 year period where I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I actually ended up working for a real estate developer in Philadelphia. And this was around 1995, 1996. And the internet was there, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked me to build a website to advertise some of his properties. So I went out, learned HTML, put the website up, and I was hooked. I was like, this is amazing. This is what I want to do with my life. So I went back and got a master's in information systems and have been doing software engineering now for over 25 years. I went through and I became a software engineer, a senior software engineer, principal. Then I went over to the dark side and became an architect. Hands-on, of
Hang on.
course.
That's what I do. Don't disparage
That's
architects. Come
right.
on.
That's right. That's right. And then, again, you know what the difference between a software engineer and an architect is, right?
Is it the amount of espresso consumed?
It's close. It's actually that an architect can draw pretty pictures. That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
about
It's
it.
it's all the box and line diagram.
That's correct. So, and then, senior software architect, and now I've held the role a couple of times now as chief architect, and I still really love what I do. You can point back and look at some of the projects or the software that you've built that's live today, and it's something to be very proud of. And when you can apply that to a good mission of the company that you really believe in, then that's like icing on the cake.
Do you feel like your business background is a benefit, especially as an architect? Because I feel like when I became an architect, a huge part of it is trying to become that trusted advisor for your business partners and making it clear to them that you understand or empathize with their problems, and it isn't just, well, here I've got some shiny technology I'm trying to sell you.
It did 100%. Actually, one of the books that I read in undergrad, which was called Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers, was all about how to introduce change into social groups.
Mm-hmm.
In
Great
addition,
book, by the way.
fantastic book. In addition, you're learning about organizational behavior. You're learning how to write business plans, which is a great thing if you're, a solutions architect. And you're learning solid communication skills at the same time, having to work with teams. Not that you wouldn't do that as a software engineer, coming out with a comp sci degree, but it's certainly more emphasized in a school of business than it is
Right.
in a comp sci program. So absolutely, it certainly did help me from my perspective. Uh, Also, a lot of what I did from a software engineering perspective was self-taught, right? I mean, I
Oh,
certainly
sure.
went and got my master's, but I also learned so much over the years on my own. So I
Hmm.
guess that's the common theme as software engineers and architects. We're constantly having to learn new things, and it comes in waves, big
Right.
huge waves that often come crashing down on us, unfortunately.
Right. No, I think that's a great way of phrasing it, and not just because of what you chose for your virtual background here today, but it definitely feels that way. Where despite the fact that there's so many different paths getting into software, and that's one of the things I find fascinating. I don't think any two software engineers have the same path. You've got everything from I worked with someone who was a chemistry major, and he was a very good software engineer. We had someone on staff at one point that had a PhD in music of some sort or another, and they were, a very good software engineer. So there's just all these different ways of getting there, but it's that ability, that desire to continue to learn new things. I don't know if other industries sort of consume and destroy knowledge the way we do. It seems like that thing we were doing that 5 years ago was so hot, now nobody does that anymore. And all that really useful information, yeah, you got to throw that away. I mean, I think if you're a doctor, obviously you're learning new things, but a lot of the basics still hold, I'm guessing. I don't think
Yeah.
it's like we're completely doing it totally differently than we did just a few years ago. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not unique to software, but it feels that way.
No, it's certainly true. I mean, some of the best software engineers that I've ever worked with in my life actually graduated from the Berklee School of Music, which,
Yeah.
ironically, several of them.
Right.
Um, I couldn't agree more. And as far as, yeah, that's correct. We don't just destroy it; we eviscerate it, right? We drop a
Hmm.
nuclear bomb on it, and it becomes anathema. And to anybody that wants to talk about it, they're like, no, 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 don't tell me about Angular
Hmm.
anymore. It's React right now.
Right.
Of course, the Vue people are like, no, 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 it's not
No,
React
we don't
anymore.
do
It's
that.
Vue.
Yeah, I mean, I've got these great threads that I use in some of my presentations that talk about that. That by the time you finally get comfortable with something, it's outdated. You got to move on. And I do think that is the real constant thread for people who have a long, successful career, is that ability to retool. Although it takes a toll. I mean, especially as you get older, eventually you're like, oh God, do I really want to learn another JavaScript framework?
It's interesting as the more decades you work, you see these cycles.
Oh yeah.
When Lambdas came out, like function as a service, and in AWS, to me, I was like, oh, these are just PL1 programs on a mainframe. That's all they are.
Hmm.
It's just shared
Hmm.
processing power that you're sharing with other people. And of course, microservices have come. Now micro apps are popular, and now people are like, well, maybe I don't want to do microservices. Maybe I just want to build an
Right.
application. And it's just these cycles. I'm waiting for the fat client to come back,
Oh,
right?
for sure.
The
Well,
big
I
fat
mean,
heavy client that does edge processing, right? Because edge
yeah,
computing
well,
is starting to be popular now.
that's such a good point, because you and I have been doing this for a while. Let's just say we don't need to date ourselves,
No,
but we've seen this pendulum swing back and forth. There was a time where no, everything's a thin client, and then oh no, we got these big powerful computers. We're going to put everything on the desktop, and then like, oh wait, that's actually really painful. Well, let's go back to a thin client. It took me a little while. I did a lot of web rewrites in sort of the early aughts, and it took me a while to realize that the thin client web app I was building wasn't that different from the thin green screen client they were replacing. They were
so true.
forms with holes in them. Now, I wasn't constrained by some artificial, column and row kind of thing, and I could scroll, and I had like drop downs and stuff, but it was the same thing. And my college advisor once told me that the reason he went back, got his PhD, started teaching, is he got tired of just putting front ends onto databases. It took me a couple years to appreciate that that's a huge part of what we do. It's just the same pattern over and over again.
Right, right. And in some sense, it's amazing the amount of technological or architectural choices that we have today at our
Yeah.
disposal. It's like a Superman's Batman toolkit of just
Hmm.
things that you can bring to the table. Whether it's a document store. No, it's a relational database. No, I want to do both, or a
Right.
combination of both. We're very lucky to be in this age, because if you wind the clock back, there wasn't too many choices. Say back
Hmm.
in during the internet boom, for instance, that you could use, and now I think it's a double-edged sword. It's almost like it's
Right.
too much choice, too much knowledge for people to handle. But I think that's where architecture has such a good place, because the sort of patterns that you can see and the strategies you take and how you employ them do have common themes throughout,
Yes.
right? And there are certain architectural concerns that are
Mhm.
important. Right? Security is important, but usability and the trade off between those two, um,
Right.
that that doesn't go away just because we're using a new technology today, as well. And again, I kind of reference it sometimes in my presentations, like the fallacies of distributed computing are still quite valid
Still there.
today as they were when they were first written several decades ago.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that hopefully we as architects can bring to the table is that experience and that ability to see how, well, this is like that thing we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago or longer, and be able to point out to folks who are newer to the industry, haven't encountered these problems, like, yeah, no, this is the same thing we did before, and here's how we solved it then, and here's what we can do now. And as you do see those patterns repeat, you start to go, well, yeah, this isn't going to work any better this time than it did the last time we tried it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, Fuel's got a nice comment on this. So good evening, Fuel. The wheel of time turns, the ages come and pass, leaving memories that became legend. Legend fades to myth, and the myth is long forgotten. Yeah, it kind of feels that way sometimes in our industry, doesn't it?
That's
It's
that's
the
correct.
myth of,
That's quite elegant to put it. How we
well,
just sort of have short term memories, like Dory.
yep, yep, yep. Well done, Phil. Way to summarize that in a much pithier and more elegant way. So well played,
That's right. Not
sir.
not like Nate or I are savages. So
We are. I mean, we're just being like, oh, it's a quote. Okay, so but I'm still going to give you credit, Fuel, because you actually took the time to throw it in there. So
correct.
he can copy and paste, but can't write. It's fine, Fuel. I'm going to give you 100% credit. So, and good morning, Arul. Thank you for joining us. Well, and so this is one of those things. Fuel brings up cloud and Linux and things like that. And do we get some of this stuff for free? That's actually one of the, you mentioned the mainframe there briefly. Cloud computing's not that dissimilar from an abstract point of view, in the sense that it's a big pile of compute. We charge you for what you use. We shave off just what you need, and same basic concepts, very different implementation details. And we have maybe bigger abstractions now than we had before. I mean, I do feel like that's helping, as our industry matures. We don't have to build all these little itty bitty pieces. The Lego blocks are getting bigger. What
They
do you think?
are, but they're also getting more configurable. I mean,
Oh,
as you
sure.
move into building cloud native solutions, you have that very sharp knife of infrastructure as code, whether it's CloudFormation or Terraform, that we didn't have, 10 years ago. The ability
Hmm.
to be able to construct from the account level to the network level to some type of landing zone for your solution and how you're going to actually use your solution, from beginning to end, right? You that a lot of that was out of your control, and so now you have a
Right.
lot more control. Or you can go off and you can use a platform as a service and give up that control, but have that knowledge that I can just focus on building my app,
Right.
which I think works in the beginning. But if you grow and you become global, then that becomes a little more difficult.
Sure.
One of the comments there was, a lot of the stuff comes for free. That is true in terms of the security models that have been put in place by Linux and then done so well by Amazon and other cloud providers. Uh, I, I wouldn't say the free part though. If you've ever had to deal with AWS transfer costs,
Oh. Well, if you think that the subscription services that you signed up for over the last few years are nefarious in their pricing and easy to forget about, try putting something in the cloud for R&D purposes, exploration, proof of concept, and then you forget to shut it off, and then you realize, oh, that's been running for months.
Yep.
And we're trained to think that it's so cheap because so many of those things in the cloud is this fraction of a penny kind of charging model. And when you contrast it to how much it would cost for us to stand this up ourselves, it looks really cheap. I spun up a little app on one of the providers, and one of the very first things I did was set an alert on my spend. And I said, if this trends above like $50 or something, I want to be alerted. Within like 3 days, I had an alert saying, you're going to spend more than this. And I'm like, how is that possible? I have a little database. I have a little app that it like barely gets touched. And according to what I clicked, you said I get like, thousands of hours free. Oh yeah. Except for all these other things that they're not as obvious when you set something up and you go, well, okay, I guess I'm not going to run this app here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. We have an app at my organization called TED, and TED is actually a human being who's, I guess, our cloud virtual accountant who just comes around and says, you're spending too much. Why are you spending that much? I've seen a spike in your usage. You need to solve that problem. And it's interesting. It's this kind of level of maturity. When I first got to the current organization, I work for Foundation Medicine in 2017. They were right in the midst of a lift and shift from going from on-prem into the cloud. And it took us a couple years to refactor systems and
right.
As we build new systems, to build them in a more cloud native way.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the next evolution in that maturation is optimization of cost.
Yeah.
And we've done a lot of things around that. I guess I can give one example was moving away from on-demand or reserve instances to using spot and finding what the right balance is. Knowing that, of course, you can get terminated in your spot instances, and you need to fall back onto, from a resiliency perspective, onto those reserve instances. But that's not something you're thinking about when you're in the midst of just getting it all up there, right?
Right.
And then having the systems be designed to be able to accommodate working in that environment, which everything fails, and then being able to spin it back up again right away and having that kind of coded and automated. So it is interesting. But yes, we do have a process called TED, who is all about how do we make things cheaper all the time.
So Fuel is saved 5,000 a month just by changing logging levels. So keep that in mind, I guess, next time you want to try to.
That's a really good
cost
tip.
Savings, isn't it? And
aren't we all guilty of like just logging War and Peace? I mean,
of course. Well, no, there's only two possible log settings: nothing at all, and literally everything in triplicate or 10x or 20x, just in case.
That's correct. And then we spend lots of money piping it into other solutions just so we could find what we were spewing out.
Yes. This is why we need very expensive tools to help us manage all of our wonderful logs. So your cost per event, that's interesting. So assume that it was roughly linear to the count of events. I wonder if it actually was Fuel. I think Grady Booch has a tweet along those lines where he said something about, Conway's law says that roughly speaking, our apps will mimic the org chart, the communication channels of our company. And he said the law of cloud computing is that cost will dictate our architecture.
It's so true. It is really true because, to put your app up there is easy and it's not as expensive as you think it's going to be. But then when you start adding in resiliency across even region, you start to see those transfer costs. Then all of a sudden you're going to want to start backing up, and then you have to store those backups. It adds up very quickly.
Yeah.
I guess another AWS technique that we used that really helped us lower our costs was using intelligent tiering. That was, we were storing, we got, I think 40 terabytes of data. I mean, just massive amounts of data. And just by implementing tiering, dramatically lowered the costs.
So Fuel, so they had an instance where they were capturing some logs. They deployed it. It generated 50 million log events per minute. So that was quickly undeployed. Probably wise. Probably wise. Raul made a good comment earlier saying that there are just these, there are more principles, these core principles, foundational principles, first principles, or whatever you want to call them. And that's why some of these works are forever relevant. And I guess that does speak to maybe the maturing of our industry, the fact that some of these things are becoming more consistent. But one of the things I've noticed is knowledge of that is not evenly distributed. So I'll take Gang of Four as a perfect example of that. I was talking to somebody a few years ago and I just offhand mentioned, well, that's just a facade pattern or something. And they just blank look. And I'm like, facade from Gang of Four. No idea. I'm like, well, have you ever read the Gang of Four book? And no, I don't even know what you're talking about. I had to Google the title of the book because I didn't remember. I just knew it was Gang of Four. And I grew up with it, right? So that was just something that I picked up as I matured in my career. And I realized, well, this person just came out of college. They don't teach that in Computer Science 101 anywhere. So how do we make sure that the folks who are joining our industry now are aware of, familiar with some of this, what you and I would consider just, part of everyday lore and software?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when you come out of college with that comp sci degree, and again, I did not, there is a level of almost apprenticeship that you might want to have to go through to understand these things. And it's great when you go to a startup because you're going to give it lots of responsibility and you're going to be able to put your headphones on and just knock out code. But they're not going to spend the time necessarily to set up a development plan for you. At the same time, the flip side is you go to some large corporation and you're employee 6,944,
right?
And you'll get that individual development plan, but you might not get any chance to actually do anything you want to put on your development plan. But you will hopefully get introduced to some of those patterns and solid principles, for instance, right? What's fair data and all these kind of principles that we know and have learned over time. It's a real challenge, I think, breaking into the industry. Because you don't know as a graduate which direction to go.
Right.
And because you have lots of choice. So, do you go startup? Do you go a large company? Do you go consulting company? I'd argue the consulting company is great as a young professional because you get lots of professional polish. Right. They do invest because they have to put you in front of a paying customer. So they're not just going to send you out there raw. They're going to give you some training and they're going to give you development, and you have to be up to date and be able to speak to the customer about these type of principles. So as a young professional, working in consulting is fantastic.
Yeah. Plus, you usually get exposed to a lot of different domains, see different companies, different orgs, and that can be really useful as well. Although it is interesting to me how universal some of these things are. I've told a lot of stories in presentations and had people come up to me and they're like, so where'd you say you worked? And I'd say, and they're like, oh, man, I could have sworn you worked for us. We had that exact same meeting last week. I'm like,
yes.
Yep. I don't know how to feel about that. I mean, on the one hand, I guess it's job security, but on the other hand, it's like, really, we're not in we haven't figured that out yet. Like we're still doing that. So yeah, so Fuel echoes that, saying that, working as basically employee number 2 all the way up to you're the 300,000th person we've ever hired, it can be incredibly useful. And, I do think consultancy can be really powerful in the learning experience. It is a different lifestyle, sometimes there's a lot of travel typically, but, I think it's part of what I do love about this space though, is there's a lot of different ways to practice it and different types of software to build. Did you ever do anything like with embedded? Like I've never done that, but I've had a bunch of students who have, and they give me such a rich sort of vein to think about. Like, I've never even thought about that as a constraint.
No, I would say the nearest thing I did to hardware was working at Children's Hospital. I worked on early barcode scanning, which was, this was before, what they do now, of course, is they scan your wrist bracelet and they enter it into the computer. Right. Everything is barcode scanning in the hospital now, but they didn't have it at the time. And it was actually for barcode scanning breast milk. So that we would know that when a woman pumped and put it into the fridge. When we returned it, it was the right milk going to the right mom, going to the right baby.
Right.
But it was interesting because then you get into the whole human element of this nurse, wants to scan the barcode, but at the same time, she doesn't really have a third hand to walk around with this gigantic scanner. Now, what I've seen nurses do in more of a modern age is they've got a lanyard and they've got the little phone hanging off the lanyard, and they can just pick it up and scan that way.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good reminder that the software we write almost always has a human on the other end of it at some point, somewhere in the chain. And it's interesting when we lose sight of some of those physical limitations. There was an infamous thing, and I don't remember which delivery service it was, but they decided that they were going to have lunch on us in New York City. And so one day for, I think it was 3 hours, every registered user in New York could order lunch like up to $15 and it would be free. Well, the software handled it just fine. They did a great job of scaling up. They must have been ready for it. Maybe they even tested it, who knows. But the physical side of it, as in the actual restaurants, many of them got 10x, 20x, 50x the number of orders they normally get during that time period. So they didn't have enough staff. They didn't have enough ingredients. They showed pictures of just piles and piles and piles and piles of these orders coming in. And then there wasn't enough delivery staff to actually get the orders to people. So orders were showing up hours late, if at all. And it's a reminder that, oh yeah, sometimes the software actually does affect the real world. It isn't just zeros and ones on my software, works on my box.
Oh, it's so true. 100%.
So what do you think is the next big wave crashing over us? Do you think AI qualifies, or is it still hype phase?
It is hype, and it is crashing hard on us, and we're being thrown on a pile of rocks in Hawaii, like lava rocks. Right. It is a big wave. And on the other hand, my organization is starting to look at it, and we used it at a hackathon within our organization, and there's some pilots that we'd like to run.
Sure.
I think it is, obviously there is a lot of hype. There's a lot of concerns around intellectual property. There's a lot of concerns around privacy, security, you name it, right? And a lot of those same concerns you could have applied to original cloud computing. You could have applied to any type of blockchain, and you see these patterns, right? These waves, if you will.
Sure.
But my opinion, I'm more of a glass half full person. I see AI as what I would call a human force multiplier.
Sure.
In that we become Tony Stark with our Friday, helping us through the day. The idea is not to replace a pathologist. It's to help a pathologist be able to determine what type of cancer it is faster. It's not going to replace a client's service rep. It's going to help them to be able to help customers better and quicker. And that's going to make happier customers, right?
Right.
So it doesn't matter what domain it's going to be applied to. I don't see it being a wholesale disruption like the Industrial Revolution, where we're going to have massive unemployment if you're not working in a factory. It is, a matter of fact, going to help, I think, in many, many different ways. However, it's going to be a rocky road for the next 2 or 3 years.
For sure.
But those that take advantage of it will have a tremendous amount of advantage over those that don't.
So Fuel apparently is getting some pressure to use more AI at work. And of course, the problem is, well, we got other things we got to solve too. We can't just stop and just focus 100% on AI for the next 6 months.
No, I mean, and honestly, we're all really stretched thin these days.
Yes.
I feel like there's this constant do more with less all the time. And I would say, if you can somehow tie it to an existing program or project, and that's kind of what I'm looking at next year.
Sure.
how can I inculcate it into something that we already have to do anyway?
Right.
That's not going to be too disruptive at the same time. But
Yeah.
again, it is definitely the thing right now in technology,
Sure.
and it's moving incredibly fast. It that analogy I gave earlier about sort of lifting and shifting into the cloud and then optimizing for cost and how you utilize the cloud more efficiently. I think this would be the same thing. I would think we're kind of in a lift or shift mode into these large language models.
Mm-hmm.
But then we're going to have a couple of years of learning how to use them efficiently and how to lower the cost of their usage because they're still
Right.
expensive.
Right. Well, it seems like so often in our space, something new comes out, it gets a lot of hype. We start applying it in places that we shouldn't. And, there seems to kind of always be this big raging success. Somebody puts out a white paper or somebody shows some really amazing thing and everyone's like, oh my God, we have to do that. And you get all the copycats. And then somebody uses it in a location where this is not a good idea. This is really a bad idea. And it implodes. And then people are like, oh, see, nobody should ever use that thing. And then eventually we just sort of like stop talking about it and it just sort of finds its niche and we use it and it's no longer this big noisy thing anymore. And I'm expecting the same kind of thing here where you're going to see advertising, so to speak, for, now new and improved with AI. And then in a couple of years, we'll be like, oh, well, yeah, of course we use that. Let's just take it for granted that it's in there.
Yeah, let's definitely not use it to replace therapists, please. Not a good idea.
Fair point. So Fuel asked ChatGPT to handle a production incident. It contacted stakeholders, worked with support to draft a message to all the users, and read logs and published fixes to GitHub.
That's right.
I've been called snarky.
That's right. That's how you become a 10x engineer.
That's right. You offload that to ChatGPT. And without a doubt, you're going to see that. I saw a headline a couple of weeks back, maybe it was earlier, that basically said, this is the end of software engineers because large language models will replace software engineers. And for sure, you can point to the trivial write the game of life kind of thing for me, or I've seen some of these very trivial sort of coding examples. But the best response I had is, well, as soon as a customer can tell me exactly what they want, then I'll worry about being replaced by a large language model. Until then, I think I'm probably okay.
Correct. I mean, I'll certainly, use something like Code Warrior without a doubt, and I'll take advantage of it. But again, I think it's all crowdsourced knowledge if you think about it.
Right.
And what if you don't want crowdsourced knowledge? What do you want is something unique and different, where you have just a different perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
What you put in there might always be what you want when it comes back out again.
Right. Well, and as much as we always assume that the wisdom of crowds is never wrong, sometimes it is. And there are black swan events where this actually isn't the right move, even though it is 9 times out of 10. Well, you're the 10th. And that's still where there has to be some amount of reflection. My concern with the way some people seem to be talking about generative AI is that we'll trust it well before we should. And you get to the point where you rely on it again and again, and then bad things happen. I know there's a similar problem in the piloting industry with autopilot. Autopilot is so good that there's a lot of pilots who don't really fly the way you and I would think about them flying the plane. And there's at least in some veins of pilots trying to say, no, you got to have control, turn that off, fly by your skills more to keep that sharp, so that when something goes south, you're not like, God, I haven't dealt with this in 3 years. I don't remember what to do.
A lot of people had to die to make airlines safe these days.
That's a good point. I hope we don't have to go through that with self-driving cars and generative AI.
That's correct. I do not want a large language model in my car right now.
No, that seems like a bad idea. So Fuel wonders, should we replace parents and teachers with generative models? And perhaps I could see that with teaching, sort of, in the sense that imagine that teacher who will answer 1,000 questions and never get grumpy or snarky or frustrated that their toddler continues to ask them the same questions over and over again.
It's a brilliant idea. I never thought that I could just when my teenage son comes to ask me for something, I should just turn around and ask Chat GPT to like give me a response.
Sure. Let me know how that works. No, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And I think without a doubt, there are some force multiplier aspects to this. I very much think where these become useful is instead of searching the docs, just ask, how do I configure this, or what is the configure? I mean, things like that to me seem pretty obvious, but I'm hesitant to say that this is somehow going to put 70% of the workforce out on the breadlines. But who knows? We
Yeah, I
live
mean,
in interesting times.
my fear is that people have a blanket, just trust it. We all saw how well that went with people using auto drive on Teslas, right?
Right.
And they say, "Oh, I'll just go draft this technology spec using Chat GPT," but not actually read through the whole thing. And
Right.
that's going to cause problems down the road.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
It's a
I
time
know that.
saver, but it doesn't replace the need for, in my opinion, a human review.
Right.
I think we're years away from just a blanket trust of, yes, I know this will always work and I don't have to worry about it.
Right. But I can see where some of that will be incredibly powerful, and it's probably going to be here before we know it. You and I were just in New York a few weeks back, and I think it would be super helpful to have Friday Jarvis running in the background saying, well, I see that you and Jeremy are both going to be in New York. Would you like us to make dinner reservations at this restaurant that we think you both will enjoy? That would be pretty amazing, that you'd have something that could just do that on your behalf instead of you having to go, oh shoot, we didn't make any reservations, or I didn't even know Jeremy was going to be there, whatever. I think that kind of stuff has some really interesting applications. Now, I don't know if that's 6 months away or 6 years away, but my guess is that will be here before we know it.
I think so. I think a lot of organizations that are service based are the ones that are going to be the most aggressive in the use of this technology.
For sure. Do you think that'll start to replace the phone agents that you call occasionally?
Do you assume those people are humans?
Not always. Not always, for sure.
That's
I mean, there's
correct.
definitely times where it's an automated response, but I guess it's getting better.
No, they're going to pass the Turing test soon enough, man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Fuel agrees with the ability to extract information written by and for humans, but the human still needs to be able to review it. And I mean, it's certainly useful, although again, still having that review there. And yeah, Fuel, I think AI is definitely going to up the spammer game for sure. I think we're going to start to see some scams that are virtually indistinguishable from real people, and I think that will undoubtedly start preying on folks, where it's going to sound like your kid or your mother or somebody, like, I need, please send me money. I'm lost. I lost my credit cards. I broke my leg, whatever. And they'll prey upon that emotion. And I think it's going to be really hard for the normal kinds of, wait a minute, kind of things that we use to trigger that. I think it's going to make it even harder for us to sort of disambiguate that.
Right. That's correct. Yeah, it is interesting. We just mentioned blockchain earlier, and how, if you remember, just that everything had to be blockchain. Everything was blockchain, blockchain,
Right.
blockchain.
Right.
And then what we discovered about blockchain was that using blockchain or some cryptocurrency to buy candy bar took 6 hours of compute time, right? And was basically leading us even further into climate change, right? And
Right.
so I think I do have some concerns around how much processing it takes to do these, and what's the environmental impact as more and more people use these large language models, and the amount of compute it takes to execute just a simple little answer is something that I guess we as humans have to be a little concerned about.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so the idea here maybe to be apply some intelligence on the outputs when they don't quite line up, maybe not. And the way I would read this comment is we shouldn't just blindly assume the answer is correct just because it came from a computer. I think, to me, this even further heightens that need for sort of digital literacy, the idea that just because it's published online doesn't mean it's true. Just because the generative AI model told you something doesn't mean it's accurate. It may just be bad inputs. We put a bunch of garbage in, we got garbage out. It doesn't change that equation, at least not that I can see.
No, that's what's going to take a long time is truly training these models and curating them, constantly curating them. Is what's going to take time to perfect.
So you are, to a certain extent, self-taught in this space. Do you have any tips or tricks that you use to deal with these new waves as they come crashing in, to pick up new languages, new technologies? I mean, I shudder to think how many things you and I have learned and forgotten about in our careers. But for someone who's maybe just getting started, do you have any advice for how to not get slashed across the rocks?
Yeah, I mean, I would say try to limit your work hours to no more than 50 hours a week. I completely violated that during the internet boom when I was working 70 hours a week. And when you're young, I guess you can do something like that. But
right.
If you can, try to limit that and carve out 5 hours a week, right? To actually go off and play with something, read about something, carve out time to go to a conference. And if you work that won't pay for it, honestly, pick a really good one and pay for it yourself. Because you're investing in yourself and you're investing in your future. But really, I mean, what I've done over the years is I've always carved out that time. Even with, I'm a widow raising 3 kids, I still carve out 5 hours a week. And that 5 hours is my time to go off and keep up on technology, keep up on architectural trends, play around with some new tools that I might not have, that I want to experiment with. And this is something that you can either parlay with work or it can be completely separate from work. But that is really the discipline that it takes to stay in this industry. And that's just my opinion.
Right. Well, I would completely echo, it has to be a habit, however works for you. And, I've long practiced what I call morning coffee. You take that first 20 minutes, half an hour in the morning when you're having your first cup of coffee, tea, whatever your favorite beverage is, and you peruse the technical news, whatever that means for you, whether that's listening to a podcast, watching a video, reading a white paper, reading a blog post, reading a newsletter, whatever works for you. And you do it regularly, and it's so much easier if you just kind of pick up a little bit at a time. I think the other thing I would echo is don't be afraid to leverage your friends and your network. I am not an expert on Git, but I have a couple folks in my network that know it cold. And so when I have a question or a problem, I'm just like, hey, Raju, what the heck should I do here? And what's the difference between this and this? So you don't have to be an expert on every single nuance in our space. In fact, you cannot be. The heat death of the universe is going to happen first.
Yeah, I would say there's another technique, to be honest with you, is present on it. It could be at a local meeting. It could be at a lunch and learn at your company. But there's no better way to learn something new than to go off and have to present on it.
It's an outstanding motivator.
It is. And also it builds up skills that we need.
Yeah.
Even a software engineer who's coding, 35 out of the 40, hours during the week still needs to be able to speak up during, stand up and use complete sentences and be able to tell people what they're working on or what challenges they're having. And the ability to get up there and present in front of people is a skill that, if you're going to go on to be a senior software engineer, tech lead, or if you're going to be a principal and mentor other software engineers, or you're going to be an architect, you're going to need those skills. And so you sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone by doing that.
Right. Yeah, that's great advice. And I think when I talk to people who are thinking like, why am I not getting promoted? Why is this person getting promoted over me? What do I need to do to get promoted? A lot of times it boils down to, well, how are your soft skills? And I think that's something we ignore at our own peril in this space.
Correct. 100%.
How did you get into the presenting game? I don't think I've ever asked you that. What brought you to that space? How did you sort of find yourself up in front of crowds? Because I know for a lot of people, there's nothing more terrifying than, here, let me present on that.
Yeah, I know. It becomes an addiction, so be aware.
It does.
I was always a very good speaker, speaking extemporarily. Having had to do that at my prior software engineering jobs and in
Sure.
college, being in student government, but in terms of speaking from a technology perspective, it really started actually at meetups.
Oh, sure.
And one of the first things I ever talked about was REST and how to build REST web services. And I was given an opportunity a couple of times to speak at a couple conferences. And I would say that it went fairly well. But then one of the things that I remember most, that was most impactful, was I got to speak at one of the first UberConfs. It's a major Java technology conference. And I was speaking on Java concurrency. And I get up there, I have my presentation ready to go. I can't remember who they were, but like in walks like two experts on Java concurrency. Like literally these people wrote books on Java concurrency.
Yep.
And thankfully, a friend and former colleague and longtime fellow speaker, Mark Richards, was in the room and also came in to see my talk. Well, everything went wrong. Demo went wrong. It was too short. It just wasn't. The material was good, and the demo would have been good, and there were just technically a lot of things wrong with it.
Sure.
And afterwards, Mark took me aside and spent like an hour with me, just saying, "Here are the things you can do to improve yourself." And after that, I practiced those things and got better and better at it.
Yeah.
And really became addicted to doing it because I love teaching. I think another life I would have been a teacher.
Yeah.
And 100% would have loved doing it. And I love the engagement in the people that I get to meet when I go to these conferences. Ironically, a lot of what Mark Richards said to me ended up getting codified into a book called Presentation Patterns.
Yeah. It might have had something to do with that.
Which exactly. And I have a copy of it. Even
Fantastic.
though I was a very, very experienced speaker, I went out and bought the first edition and read it cover to cover because there was always things I could improve on. But a lot of what Mark had told me were lessons in that book.
Yeah, we definitely crowdsourced some of that material, to say the least. And we also had the good fortune of being able to test it in the crucible of repeated conference engagements, from No Fluff Just Stuff to various other events. And so you take combined, I don't even want to know how many hours of presenting experience. Turns out we made a lot of mistakes and learned from them, and hopefully other people can learn from those as well. But I think you're hitting on a lot of important stuff here, which is this willingness to look at your own sort of skill set and say, I need to get better at this, and I need to invest in myself. And I think that's the right way to look at it, is these are investments in yourself that you are taking. And that's the way you've got to think about that time and that energy.
Right. And sort of the squeaky wheel gets the oil. A lot of times people might be a little hesitant upon saying to their boss or to the company or hey, I'd like to go to this conference, or I'd like to go take this course. Honestly, it never hurts to ask.
Yeah.
And if you get it, that's fantastic. It shows motivation on your part to better yourself, and your boss or manager or mentor is going to see that. At the same time, if that's not happening for you, there are things that you can do on your own to invest in yourself.
Yeah, I think a good friend of ours, Ken Cousin, has a point on that when he talks about managing your managers, that you have to advocate for yourself. Your manager can't read your mind. If you need something or want something, let it be known. And to your point, if they say no, well, that could be an interesting data point, because if they're not willing to help you with some of those things, that might give you some thoughts on maybe I should work somewhere else. Maybe I need to find a different kind of company. Why aren't they willing to do that? But I completely agree with you that sometimes we just have to do it ourselves, and we have to take that time and sometimes spend our own money. I'm amazed how many folks are so unwilling to do that. And I thought, well, I think that is part of the job, to a certain extent, at least.
Right. And there's ways you can sort of make it fun. Years ago, I went to speak at DevNexus, a fantastic conference down in Atlanta, and it coincided with school vacation. So I took the kids. They got to see whale sharks and at the aquarium there. And I got to, geek out at DevNexus, and it was a lot of fun, right?
Yeah.
So whether it's a partner that you want to bring, or kids, or maybe just a friend come along with you. Sometimes or find another software engineer that wants to travel with you and say, hey, let's go to this conference together, right? Then you don't have to think of it as just an outlay of money for training. You can think of it as an event where you're also going to have a good time as well.
Yeah, you can make these things family outings if you want. I mean, my family has been to an awful lot of places that coincided with me being there for a conference or an engagement of some sort, and that's part of why my family is as well traveled as they are. My son's been to, I guess he's got 3 continents knocked off at this point. So
fantastic.
He's got to go to a lot of pretty cool places. So it definitely can be more than just showing up and grudging your way through a book. So Fuel, actually, there are a lot of in-person events these days. Now, we can have an interesting debate about how well attended they are or aren't compared to pre-pandemic times. I would say European events are doing smashingly well. US events are still struggling a bit, although I think that's starting to turn.
Yeah, I would say like Jack's London is incredibly well attended. I'm not going this year, but and honestly, that's even better if it's not a lot of people, because then you really get to know some of the attendees around you. You get to interact with the speakers a little more, and you're not like number one in a 200-person room.
Right.
So there are some advantages there.
Yeah, and I would point out one of the biggest pluses of a conference is the hallway track. The fact that you are there with hundreds, or in some cases thousands, of engineers just like you who are having similar problems to you. I guarantee somebody in that audience can help you with the problem you're having now or will have in the future, and vice versa. And it's an outstanding opportunity to make some new friends.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, grown my LinkedIn network from going and it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't have to be like you're going to a major conference. It could be meetups as well. Yeah. I agree with you. I think there'll still be this virtual aspect to these conferences for a while. But I think the trend will move towards people going back in person,
right?
Because you want to get away from the rut, like especially if you're a traditional software engineer. It's like sprint after sprint after sprint after sprint. Guess what we're doing next week? Another sprint.
Another one.
Right. So to get out of that rut for a week is it's not just a vacation. You're going to learn something. You're going to interact with people. Is something that's is tremendously valuable professionally.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you can burn out pretty easily when it's just, and then another one, and then another one, and yet another defect for me to fix, yet another thing for me to implement. And okay, great. When does it ever change? Well, it doesn't. When does the project end? It doesn't until we decide we're no longer investing in this.
That's correct.
So you hinted at this at the beginning, and I wanted to circle back to it, but I remember when we had both types of databases. You had hierarchical and you had relational. You could have any database you wanted as long as it was a relational database, ultimately. Nowadays, we've got, I don't know, a dozen different data store options, and we have this plethora of choice. And do you feel like we've tripped over into the paradox of choice, where you sit down and start a new project, and instead of it just being, well, I'm going to pick A, B, and C because that's what we do all the time, now it's, well, man, maybe I should use a different kind of data store. Maybe I should use this other framework. How do you counteract that paradox of choice?
I think it's very important to have an abstraction over your data layer.
Yeah.
One of the things I discovered more recently was having a lead architect on a solution where we use DynamoDB, essentially a glorified document store, and it worked really well. And now as it grew in complexity and size, I realized, well, actually, this really should be a relational store, right? And so but if you're, but if you have a layer of abstraction where you can do that sort of transformation seamlessly, not seamlessly, but with effort, of course,
Right.
then if you want to swap that out later on, say you're doing something like CQRS,
Yeah.
and you've got a read-only store that's, in second normal form, you can change how you interact with that data layer, where your reads, or you're pulling out data points from some JSON object, and you're hitting the read-only store, which is denormalized, made for quick return of data. And at the same time, you've got this event-driven microservice, which is sitting there loading up the third normal form database, right? Where you're gonna keep your data, your gold data, if you will, the system of record, and all the commands, the transactions that are coming down. So that layer, that thinking of the data as just a layer is important, because it's likely going to evolve over time, and you may not want it to impact, say, for instance, your API.
Right.
You may not, and you may not want to impact how the users are using their user interfaces. You might want to hide that from them, and so having that, I think, is pretty important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's another place where some experience becomes very beneficial. You, with enough project issues, experiences, failures, you start to recognize, I'm going to need to have a layer of abstraction here.
Yeah.
If I tie myself too tightly to this, that's going to cost me. Maybe not in 6 months, maybe not in a year, but eventually I'll pay for that. And I do think that's one of the advantages of been there, done that, have the T-shirt.
But I don't regret your decisions.
Right.
Hindsight is always 20/20.
Oh, for sure.
Making a decision is half the battle. And the software works. And if a year later you realize you need to go back and refactor that area, because it's more successful, that's not on you. It's not like you didn't make the wrong decision. It's just that you made a decision, and you looked at the trade-offs and you made a decision. That's a good thing.
Right. Yeah, I think virtually every decision is wrong over a long enough time frame. and you just have to be comfortable with that, and realize that you made the best decision you could with the limited amount of time you had and the limited resources, and you can't afford to be in analysis paralysis forever.
That's true.
Well, Jeremy, I know that you have more important things to do than just hang out with me on a random Monday. I do thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm delighted that we got an opportunity to hang out a little bit here a few weeks ago, and I hope our paths cross sometime sooner than the last. I mean, I very distinctly remember hanging out with you in Oslo, and I feel like it's been too long since you and I've been in the same space, my friend.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. Hopefully sometime in 24, man.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time, brother.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye-bye.